Hi, this is Mike Ricker, and I'm here to give my recommendation on how to cut down on a lot of the squeaking complaints we're getting on engineered products. I think we've seen a great escalation of squeaking claims on wood flooring over the last few years, and one of the biggest reasons is markets that used to be solid markets are using a lot more engineered product. And not just are they using a lot more engineered, using a lot of half-inch thick engineered. The reason is, in the past, traditional engineered markets was the South, where they had slab construction. All those floors were glued down. So you didn't have much squeaking because there wasn't much movement on a glued down floor. Now that they're moving up north, everything's over pier and beam construction, and they're being stapled to subfloors. And as we all know, engineered products usually have a little bit of a bow. Here's a piece out of a box, and it's going the good way, which is towards the face rather than skiing away from the face. However, when you staple these down, the staple has to be strong enough to hold that bow out of the wood. If it's allowed to raise back up over time, it causes movement, which will lead to squeaking. And as the half-inch is becoming the popular choice up here with builders rather than the 3/8, the wood is that much stiffer and that much harder to hold flat. To demonstrate that, I've taken some flat pieces of half-inch engineered, and I've shimmed up the two sides 1/32 of an inch. Then I stapled it down. And as you can see, the staple's backed out and you now have movement. And if I move this just right, you can hear it squeaking. Hopefully that's picking up on the iPad. But the little bit of movement that's there, the staple lets loose, the wood goes up and down the staple, and you have a lot of squeaky floors. I can't tell you how many squeaky floor claims we've had this year, but I know it's pretty dramatic, and with all brands of hardwood. The problem is, when you look at the instructions, folks can follow the instructions correctly and still lead to unsatisfactory results with squeaking on their floors. The biggest reason is the subfloors nowadays. In the past, plywood was the #1 subfloor. Over the last couple decades, everybody's moving to OSB because of the cost savings. The plywood, very robust. If I try to push this scratch all into the plywood, I can push with all my might, and it only goes in about 1/4 of an inch. OSB that's undamaged is pretty tough too. I can push hard, it goes in about 1/2 an inch, but it's still pretty tough to put in. This is OSB that I soaked in water overnight. And if you watch this one, I push this scratch all in, it goes all the way through to the back. And the really amazing thing is watch how much effort it takes to pull this out. There's no way a little staple is going to hold its legs in this with the resistance of the engineered flooring trying to back it out. So I believe the problem is we've gone from plywood to OSB to damaged OSB, and we're still trying to staple down engineered product in the same manner. It's just not working. Now the challenge is current instructions only have a moisture content requirement at time of install. And by looking at these two, you cannot tell the OSB from the water damaged OSB. They're 100% the same. And when you look at the data, people will tell you OSB holds nails better than plywood. And when it's wet, it holds nails much better than plywood. But if you look at the ASTM standards, what they're measuring is how much force it takes to blow the sheathing off of the house in a hurricane or a tornado. So it's how much force it takes to pull this nail all the way through, head and all, and let the sheathing loose. Plywood and OSB are pretty comparable. Plywood is not quite as good as OSB because you have so many more pieces of wood making that up, especially when it's wet. When it gets wet, it swells and it really holds onto that nail well. The problem though is when it dries out. Then you have all kinds of looseness, it swells, there's small delaminations between all the layers, and then your nail holding is greatly diminished. Whereas plywood, even if it does delaminate, you still have all the plies the nail is going through, you still have the holding power. So the issue is an installer could go to a house, and if you think about it, how many new homes OSB is damaged? I would say 100%. Either it sits outside at the lumberyard, it sits outside at the side of the house before it gets installed, or it's nailed down and sits there while the roof is put on. So it's all going to get damaged for more than a day, probably several weeks worth of water before it actually has the flooring applied to it. But by the time the flooring mechanic gets there, it's dried out, they do the moisture check, It's under the 12% required or 13% required, and they can staple down to it with confidence. There's no test to determine whether or not that has any nail holding ability left. Just having somebody poke a good one with a scratch awl and see it doesn't go in, and a bad one that does go in, there's no way you're going to be able to put that with enough rigor around it so that people can repeat it and make it a useful test. My suggestion is to have a standard developed on testing nail holding ability of subfloors prior to installing the staple down engineered or the nail down solid that can be easily repeatable for very little money for the installer. This is a prototype I built. This cost less than $10 to make at retail. So if this was produced in mass, you'd be able to sell these for $9.99, get them out in the marketplace, and hopefully at least give the installer a chance to determine whether or not he should be nailing down to that subfloor. And if not, then you have an option of gluing and nailing at the same time, or just gluing. That way we would have less callbacks and less problems with the squeaking claims that we have today. So the concept of this is simple. It's a torque wrench with a pry bar at the end. Now I'm going to do a quick example here. I have a piece of plywood. It'd have to be a standard developed on how deep to drive it and all the details. And the tension would have to be calibrated for the flooring. But I'm just going to see how much force it takes to start backing this nail up. As I pull, I got up to 20 before I started backing. 20, pretty good, and it's still well adhered into the plywood. Now when I go to the undamaged OSB, and I'll do the same thing, just see how much it takes to start backing. I got to 25 before it did, so undamaged OSB, pretty powerful. Now I'll go to the water damaged OSB and see what it takes. And it is right at 10. So OSB, not a bad subfloor for stapling down to if it hasn't gotten water damaged. The key is we need to test so that the mechanic can determine whether or not it's safe to go over it or whether or not he should bag the nailer and glue. Thank you.